you for joining. Thank you for joining. Today, I am Kim or Kimani, depends on how you know me. Glad to be here. I'm a community outreach and training specialist with the Mental Health Association in New Jersey. And if you have not known about the Mental Health Association in New Jersey, we are an association, a statewide nonprofit organization that strives for children and adults to achieve victory over mental health and substance use disorders through advocacy, education, training, and services. We are part of I have a part of the FOC, or Families of Color program, and we are here to address mental health issues on multiple levels. So happy to have you here. Very shortly, I'm going to turn you over to Faith Saunders, who is my co-host, and we're going to be interviewing our guest today, Yvette Murray. The topic of our conversation is what you think is what you get navigating implicit bias in the BIPOC community, or when engaging the BIPOC community or partnering with the BIPOC community. The show happens in two components. The first 30 minutes is going to be a taped conversation. And then the second part of that is simply an open and discussion. We'll stop the taping and people can have questions for our guests. But I'm going to turn it over to Faith right now.
Okay, awesome. Well, wow, I am so happy to see so many people here this morning. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning. We have a really great show lined up for you. Since we started this in February, was it February? We have had some really awesome speakers. I even saw one, our last speaker from last month here, joining us. So it's great to see you, Reverend Rose. But I have another outstanding speaker here today, someone who I have known for many, many years, but also who's very, very knowledgeable about this topic of engaging individuals. And today we really want to talk about how do we start addressing our own implicit bias when we're partnering with individuals in the BIPOC community. It's so hard sometimes to kind of take that look inward, because sometimes we don't like what we see. But you can only make us better, our better people, and better at what we actually do in our lives. So without any further ado, and you guys know I don't like reading bios, so that's why I ain't got no bios here today. So the best way to learn about someone is to actually have them share about who they are. So today we have Yvette Murray, and Yvette, tell us a little bit about you, your background, and why is this topic so important to you?
Hey, thanks for having me. Oh my goodness. Well, I guess the topic's important because I happen to be a African-American woman in a racist society. So that's probably how it started off. And, just to give you some sense of my background, I actually own a firm called YRM Consulting Group. And we have a number of projects. And one of the projects that we work with is building the capacity of mental health providers and ancillary and auxiliary service providers to really have a solid understanding of how they show up in their work, and then how they show up with their work in communities that are not communities that they have knowledge of or have historical background with. I'm also a clinical social worker by training. The individuals I see are predominantly folks of color, and partly because we just do not have enough clinicians of color in the country. So we are finding that it's really important, if you happen to be a clinician of color, consider getting registered in some other states, because there are a lot of states that need us and we're just not available. And it is important for people to be able to have conversations where they can do some of the shorthand, which you can't necessarily do with a clinician that does not share lived experience. I also am a consumer. I live with bipolar mood disorder. I've been living with it since I was 14, diagnosed at 40, which is about right. And in the Black community, I had some folks tell me I was going to pray it away. That's not necessarily how that's going to work. And so I'm sort of coming at this from a number of sides, but for the most part, again, I show up here today both as a clinician and also as a consumer.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Thank you so much. Wow. So you are well equipped, as we can see. No bio. I couldn't read no bio that would actually give the substance in terms of who you really are and what you bring to the table. So we're talking about implicit bias. And one of the things is that, I know as a trainer, sometimes we kind of take it for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about, right? And sometimes, although we may know, we are looking at it through different lenses. So the
Mhm.
definitions that we do have are different. So for us to have a level playing field and to have this discussion, what is implicit bias?
Well, I want to take a step back from that and how bias actually is developed and shows up. So when we think about this notion of bias, bias actually is a product of how our brain functions and what the culture says who people are and where they fit. And in a white supremacist culture where people are racialized as white, what we find is that the bias is that white is the default and everything else is separate. So, we sort of need to start there. So there are a few things. One is that when we think about our brain and how our brains work, that our brains do shortcuts, and they have to do shortcuts. At this moment, each of us is receiving about 11 million pieces of information in this total second. Just your environment, everything around you, your brain is processing that, as well as the bodily functions that you need in order to stay alive. The brain cannot process all that information in the same way, so it has to choose and make some decisions. So functionally, our brain can only process about 40 pieces of information at a time. So what happens is that our brain then starts to create these neural pathways to then sort of say, well, this looks a particular way, so it must be like this thing over here. Part of our evolutionary development is I needed to know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and a pussycat. Saber-toothed tiger probably eat me. Pussycat may or may not let me pet it. I don't know. That's just how that's how that plays out. So I want to just sort of that notion of bias for those of you who are on the or listening. I want you to think about what is your first thought when someone says the N word. So and you're going to ask yourself, did you say, oh, N word is, oh, nice word, or is it nuanced word, or is it naughty word, or is it nigroid, or is it nigger? Because sometimes we sort of want to use these euphemisms as if somehow that changes what the word actually is. And the N word is actually constructed by the white supremacist society to make it comfortable to use the language and to use the word. So we need to sort of be mindful of that. Also, when we think about that notion of bias, in the field, we've been talking a lot more about Latinx. And what's interesting is X is not a letter in the Spanish alphabet. So again, using a white supremacist framework when it probably should be Latin A or Latin, A, but that notion of who determines what happens. So when we think about our brains, we can actually functionally process about 40 pieces of information. 98% of our mental processes are unconscious. Right now you're not thinking about your heart beating, but there's a part of you who are noticing that Faith and I are both women of color. You're probably noticing that we're different colors. You may be noticing we may be different weights. There's all this stuff you're noticing, and that's all bias. You're making a decision about what color Faith is wearing versus what I'm wearing. That's a bias. So when we think about bias in the construct of our work, what we need to be really acknowledging is that our brains are making shortcuts, but they're making shortcuts based on cultural cues about what's good and what's bad. And then all the things that sort of fall in between. The other thing that's really important is that bias and the implicit bias really is something that we're raised with. That's where bias comes from. We're raised with it, both from the media, our family, whoever raised us. All of those things are where bias shows up. And we use bias to predict what's going to happen. So if I am working with a client or I'm working with someone and I'm going to make assumptions about their gender, their sexual orientation, And I can be dead wrong because I'm using my lens in order to create that. So implicit bias is that I implicitly have a bias based on the way my brain works, but I also have a bias that is strongly influenced by nature being, or sorry, nurture being the actual environment that we're raised in and we live in.
Awesome. Wow, I learned a lot in that little definition that you said there. Well, one of the things I think is very, very important to emphasize is that implicit bias, we all have it. None of
Absolutely.
us are immune from being from
Absolutely.
having implicit bias. So that within itself kind of level the playing field, right? So
Mhm.
we are all in the same boat. What
Mhm.
may distinguish some of us is that we are aware. We've become aware, and I think it's not something that stops. It's something that we continuously do until the day we take our last breath. So it's about being more consciously aware and be taking actions
Mhm.
to address our biases. So that's wonderful that we're all, though nobody can say, well, I don't have an
Yeah.
implicit bias. We all do. So when you think about implicit bias, can you give us some examples of it? Because again, just to kind of make it more real for us. Or
Absolutely, absolutely. One of our clients happens to be a program for individuals with intellectual and developmental chat differences, neurodiverse, and there was a situation on, well, actually, it was last summer, where they, in this particular organization, they call people not clients but interns, which I think is really cool, and they're all adults, and one of the women happened to be a woman of color, and they had all gone to the pool, and some of the staff were like, look at her, she looks like Whoopi Goldberg, what do you do with that? Talking about her hair. And there was a great deal of conversation, which had never happened with any of the interns that were racialized as white. So the way people process that information, what does it mean? And hair is really important in communities. When I worked in domestic violence, one of the things that came up was that there were these concerns that women of color were not washing their hair enough. They weren't washing it every day. Women of color don't want, for the most part, again, depending on the texture of your hair, that washing it every day dries it out, and it's just not what, you just don't do it because from a cultural perspective. So part of this is really sort of asking ourselves the questions of whose values am I using? I was working in another residential program, actually we're still in domestic violence, and there was this question about what made a good parent. And there were these decisions made that a good parent fed their kids dinner by 5 o'clock or 5 or 5:30. I'm like, really? That's interesting. And what we know is that that absolutely is not true. And depending on your cultural background, I have Sunday dinner at 3. That's because my brother-in-law is making it, and that's what time it is. But that is a normal tradition for us based also on our faith community and when we're actually getting out of our faith services as to where meals may happen. So something as simple as what time a meal happens, how I am, the language I'm using, the way that someone else perceives me, all that is part of the bias that we need to be mindful of as we're working with each other.
okay. So I totally agree. So we agree that we all have implicit bias, that sometimes we're not even, most of the time we're not even
Yep.
aware of
Only
it. That
2% of the time are we actually conscious of it.
exactly. So that comes the big problem. So now how do I address this? What are some of the things that I can do to address my implicit biases or even to bring them to my own consciousness?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to remember is that we really need to have grace and humanity for each other, that we're all going to get it wrong. We're going to get it wrong all the time, all day, every day. And humility, that we need to be able to understand that humility is part of good practice. Part of white supremacist culture is that you have to be right. And if I have to be right, then that makes no room for me to grow and develop and sprout new ways of thinking in the world. So when we think or have these conversations about how do we do this, it's really important that we're asking ourselves, am I willing, and I don't believe in calling people out, but I believe in calling people in and giving, and just sort of saying, hey, you might not have gotten this information, but this is another way that people are talking about this. For me, the language of disability I find very challenging, and partly because in my community, the word dis, that first part means to ignore, put aside, doesn't, I'm dissing you.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, and particularly as a person who lives with the mood disorder, I don't want to be dissed, and I'm not, and I am not a disability. I happen to have times that I'm more productive than other times, and that's okay, and it's acceptable. And we have to really get to a place where we are able to give each other that level of grace and humanity. But we've got to come to the work with humility. That I don't know what I don't know, and my job is to be open to find out things that I just had no awareness of. A bias that recently has come up is with the situation in Ukraine, where people didn't realize that there were Ukrainians of color. And and it's a huge issue, because the fact is that Ukrainians of color could not get on those trains to get out of Ukraine, because the assumption was you don't belong, you're not us, whatever the us may be. So there are some real implications when we are not checking our bias for the real lives of human beings.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of my questions as providers or people were helping others. Why is it so important for us to be aware of this?
Well, I would even go beyond awareness, and that goes back to the authenticity and the humanity of it. I am very upfront with my clients. I know a lot of stuff about a bunch of stuff, but I don't know everything about anything. And there may be times that I may need you to guide. But that ultimately we're in a partnership. This is not a one size fits all. My job is to be here to serve, but part of my serving is also being willing to learn. Now, that doesn't mean that it's my client. I have a very large Pakistani population base in my therapy practice, and I have learned a lot. Some of it I've learned on my own, some of it I've learned through conversations, and I have an awareness that I did not have 5 years ago. And I know that my population has grown because of word of mouth. And that's one of the ways if you're making the shift, that if you're starting to see communities and populations you have not historically seen, someone gave the word that you're doing your work, or your organization is doing its work. And the word of mouth is how you'll know. And you'll start to see your numbers change based on that word of mouth.
Awesome. So, um, there, how can I put this? How do we, so this is individual work,
It's
right?
absolutely individual work.
Yeah, so it's individual work that we each have to do. But as individuals, we work within organizations. So any pointers in terms of ways organizations can help the individuals within that their structure to be more aware and be able to address some of these biases?
Well, I think the first is that the organization has to make a decision if they actually have a commitment to it. Because if there's no commitment, then quite honestly, say who you are. I mean, we found this at the beginning of the pandemic, where after the murder of George Floyd, we had lots of organizations putting out statements. But if you went beyond their front page where the statement was, it was very clear there was nothing else they were concerned about related to equity, because that's where people look to see, what are you living your values? So the first
Mm-hmm.
question, the first statement is, or first thought is this organization really interested in living the value of equity?
Mm.
And once you ask the question of, are we really committed to living the value of equity, then you need to ask yourself, what resources are we willing to put toward this? And we're talking about both capital resources, human resources, and also access resources. And when we think about this work, it happens on 4 levels. First is the individual, that I as the individual have my own work to do. And hopefully my organization is providing opportunities, either through continuing education or bringing folks in, to actually help me start to really test and think about how I see the world. We also want to make sure that we're looking at these kinds of conversations from an organizational perspective. How does our organization currently show up? If all of our leadership happen to be people who have been racialized as white, then right there we have a very clear understanding of what our value proposition is. We are living our values. Understand that when you put a budget together, a budget is a statement of your values. We put money where we think things are important and things belong. And then we have the societal piece. And the societal piece is, why are we seeing the kinds of things that we're seeing, particularly in mental health? We have an explosion of suicidality within the Black and Latino community. When I say Black, I'm talking about both African Americans as well as other people within the African diaspora. Because an African American is not necessarily someone from the African diaspora, very different, and we need to know that there are differences. So we do need to ask, sort of, what are people's lives, how are people moving through their lives? But also, if organizations are committed to this work, it's not an add-on. This is part of your day job. This is, you're going to get leave time to do the kind of work necessary. Some organizations may be maybe doing affinity groups where people are able to come together and either talk about a particular topic, or they may be talking with people who are, however it's identified, like them. Some people are doing book clubs. Some people are saying, hey, let's all watch a video together and have a 30-minute conversation, once a week or every other week. So there are loads of ways to integrate this. But if the organization is truly committed to equity in mental health wellness, then it has to be top down, bottom up, and right to left. This is not a linear process. It's very it comes from lots of different places, and to be open that there is no one answer, and the answer that you come up with will change probably in 6 months.
Awesome. So one of the things that I gather from what you just said, what I heard you say is, one, this work is very broad. It
Oh
has
yeah,
a number of different components to it. One, also, it's not something that happens overnight, right?
absolutely not.
So it's work that has to be continued, and one that has to have buy-in from the top down, especially the top down initially, to say this is something that is important to us, because the bottom up will have to do the work that the top down says that is values of
Well, yeah, there
importance,
actually
right?
is a resource that comes through Equity in the Middle,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a document called Awake to Work. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're interested in doing this work, I strongly encourage you to, check that document out, because it really does talk about the length of time it takes. And when you think about equity, and particularly equity when we think about race, and in America, everything is based on race. We were founded around the genocide of indigenous people from folks that showed up here, both intentional and unintentional genocide of indigenous folks. So when we're having these conversations, we need to understand that we're dealing with a time frame that is in excess of 400 years. So you're not going to fix it overnight. That very often, if you're looking to do this kind of work, you're really talking about a window of anywhere from just the beginning could take you 3 to 5 years. It doesn't mean you're standing still the whole time, but it really is a long-term process, and that people have to have skin in the game. And that also requires people who have been racialized as white to be willing to talk about their own life experience. And one of the things that happens very often is people engage. I find that it's very easy for many people who are white identified to engage in racial porn
What does that
and
mean?
racial porn and voyeurism, where I come to these kinds of activities and I want to hear what the brown people have to say. I don't want to put my stuff on Front Street. I don't want to talk about my Uncle Joe. I don't want to talk about how race has impacted my life. I only want to hear from the other. So if people are really interested in working on implicit bias, then you have to be willing to tell your own story. You
Mm.
have to be honest about what your story is, because if you're coming into spaces and the job is to have Black and brown folks share their experience, then you're really not there to learn, you're there to be exploited. The other is that it sets up a paradigm that suggests being Black or brown is in itself a deficit. I come from a very strong Black tradition and culture. I have children that are Black. I have friends and family members who happen to be Black. And there's a lot of joy and there's a lot of tenacity and resilience. And those are the conversations that very often don't come up when we're having conversations about bias. Very often it's tell us all the horrible things that happen. So that is what racial porn and voyeurism is, I know it sounds harsh, but that's what it is. It's I want to sit on the outside, and we do this work not for the other, we do this work for ourselves, because white supremacy negatively impacts and destroys the fabric of our own souls, as well as traumatizes all of us.
Right. So it impacts everyone. I'm sitting here trying to looking for my notes because I don't know where it did just disappeared. So I'm kind of winging it at this point, but it's okay. So Yvette, time goes by when you're having fun because we're really going into some really deep stuff. It's not surfacing, and I think that's the
No,
key thing here is that some of this may sound harsh, but if we really want to move forward, we have to dig deep. We can't do the surface thing like put the sand whatever
the
sweeping
sanitizer.
this
Yeah, no, you
the
can't do
top
it that
surface.
way.
Yeah,
I mean,
we
and the
have to
other
dig
part is
deep.
that there are, what our firm specializes in is actually working with organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit organizations, to actually embed equity in the DNA of their organization.
Mm-hmm.
So soup to nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, if the entire organization is not breathing as an organism, that actually is saying that equity is important and that you're living in equity, then ultimately you're just going to have these pockets. And you kind of know when that happens, when people say, yeah, I don't want to work with that counselor. Can I work with that one over there? When you start hearing that, it is a clear indication that something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately everyone in the organization needs to have the background and skill set. The other thing I do want to say for folks who have been racialized as white is you have a whole bunch of pre-work to do. That, starting saying, oh, let's have a committee is great. But if those who have been racialized as white don't understand that you have your own work to do, what's going to happen is you're going to come into spaces and do harm. And you're going to do psychological harm to Black and brown folks. So I have lived experience, and I've been, I'm 57, so I've been doing 57 years of lived experience. So my white colleagues have to catch up and do their work so they can actually come into spaces and have conversations that are both authentic, but also allow for that they've done their homework.
Right.
Because we're all going to get it wrong. All of us are going to get it wrong all the time. But to come to the table and you haven't gone to kindergarten, but you want to work with a bunch of PhDs, that's just not going to work. And it also demonstrates a lack of awareness, and quite honestly, it's very disrespectful.
Yeah. So before we end, I have a question, and this wasn't on my list of questions.
That's
Wherever
okay,
they
Faith. I'll
are,
go with you.
don't know where they are. It's just going to flow here. So, so you talk through this whole thing about individuals who are white versus persons who are of color, right? But it's not only about it just is most my thought. It's not only about individuals who are white and persons who are of color. It's broad because there's not just one. It's not one out. There's so much gray in the middle. So I think that in a sense, it can be misleading if we're talking in that in talking from that sense. Why can you address in terms of
Yep,
the middle ground? We're talking
absolutely.
everyone.
Absolutely, Faith. And I'm glad you brought the point out that in this country, you can't speak for, I'm not going to go into other countries. In this country, race trumps everything. That this country is founded for white males who are property owners, who very often were slaveholders. That's who the country was founded for, not everyone else. So we've got to do our origin story. So that's the first piece. Intersectionality is, I think, part of what you're discussing when we start looking at my gender, my, what might be the mental health condition that I'm
So
navigating.
what is intergender? Because again,
Right.
here we go again.
So race is your umbrella. You want to start there. And then from race, you start to do intersectional work. And very often what you'll notice is when you have these conversations, because people don't have the muscle to talk about race and power and privilege, what winds up happening is people want to jump to intersectionality. And what I would encourage all of you, when you notice the conversation start to jump to intersectionality, well, I'm a female, bring it back to race, because you've got to start at the starting point. And that race is the starting point in this country. And particularly given the time we're in now, where we're banning books and we're seeking to limit the rights of women's bodies and our choices. And we're in a place where we're making decisions that white children shouldn't feel badly about the history, although it's okay that the history was put on a whole bunch of folks and it was intentional to create trauma. That, we're living in a very interesting schizophrenic world. And we have to acknowledge it, and that everyone may not be on board. And if you make a decision to do this kind of work, understand there will be people who will decide that your organization is no longer a good fit for them. And that's okay. That sometimes people need to leave to make the space for innovation and transformation. And unfortunately, that can't always happen with the same people being at the table.
This is very interesting conversation. In terms of the schizophrenic world, I cringe on that.
I do too.
A person don't like that term.
I do too.
But we're almost out. We're almost out of time. What would you say if you had to say? I give you this opportunity to share one thing that people can actually do today, because we want to start with the practical stuff. Right? What is one thing that you would encourage people to do today to start on the journey? Individuals, because we don't have control over everyone else, but as an individual.
Well, there are a few things, and it's interesting, Faith. I use the word schizophrenic very intentionally, because very often people of color are identified as being schizophrenic, when it's like, no, we're trying to navigate the crazy that we're walking in. And I mean the racial crazy that we walk in, because it's a sick society. We are a very sick society when it comes to race and racial issues. I think the first thing that people can do is to be open, to be humble, to be open, and to bring your humanity to the work. And understand that you're probably not going to get it right most of the time, but that's okay, because ultimately, once you gain more information, you never can go back. I can't go back to not know what I just learned. So that's the thing I would say, is that, be a lifelong learner, lean in, attend events, go to events with people that are not, however you identify, like you, to see, because it's really hard to hate up close. And also, when you're up close, you also start to learn what the mores are, and the values and the traditions of other communities. And I think that's the thing all of us can do.
Really, really great points. Really deep conversation. But I know you, Yvette. I know you. So, but I thank you so much for being
You're so
here
welcome
today, and for being so candid with us.
Well, anyone who knows me, is candid is usually what I show up with.
Yeah.
I'm not one for mincing words.
So I appreciate it. This was wonderful, and we need to keep this conversation going in terms of how do we start taking the steps. What the baby steps, because as you said, this is not something that it's a lifelong work that we have to do. But how do we start the process? Because it's huge, and it's in a sense it's a uphill battle. Depends on where you are too.
Well, I think that, I love the idea that you did put in the chat, the Harvard Implicit Bias Survey. I strongly encourage people to take it and choose a few different categories, because you'll at the end go, oh, hadn't expected that. And, and it's just a nice, quick and dirty way to say, I have some learning to do.
Awesome. Because yeah, I did find my notes finally. But yeah, that's perfect. That's what I want. That's really why I was looking for the notes. Like, where's the notes? But the Harvard Project Implicit website is a great
Great
resource,
website.
right? And as Yvette just mentioned, you can actually go on and actually do different surveys
Hmm.
to actually get at least the foundation in terms of I didn't know that. That's the way I think, but it's okay, you know? It's okay.
And
So,
also remember that younger people are being raised in a very different world. When I did the survey, my responses were very different than my daughter's responses at 22. That she was much more balanced than I was. And I was like, well, that's pretty good. I guess I need to follow you.
that's great. So that's a great beginning source. So,
It is.
Kimani is going to be putting the link to the website and to where you can actually do the surveys. So, thanks again,
Oh,
Yvette,
you're
for
so
being
welcome.
here. Appreciate you, and let's keep the
Anytime.
conversation going.